Welcome to our virtual program on the past, present, and future of U.S.-India relations. This event marks the 75th anniversary of India's independence. It's also the third of 4 programs of our Narendra Gupta tribute series. We are thrilled to have Ambassador Jester with us from New York and Professor Raja Mohan, our moderator, joining us from Delhi. Welcome to our Northern California board members, advisory council, groundbreaker and innovator members, and the members from our 14 centers around the world. I'm Margaret Conley, the executive director here in San Francisco. And for today's format, I'll introduce our speakers. They'll have a moderated discussion, and then we're going to open the floor to audience Q&A. So please have your questions ready. Go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We'll get to as many questions as possible. We have an hour for this program. We'll finish at 7 p.m. in San Francisco. That's 10 p.m. in New York and 7:30 a.m. in Delhi. This event is on the record and we are recording. The video will be available on our website in about a week. And for those joining our VIP reception, have that second Zoom link that was emailed to you ready at the end of the program, and we'll have an off-the-record conversation with our speakers. Our bios for our speakers are on our website, and I will start with a few words about our guest speaker, Ambassador Kenneth Jester. He has over 4 decades of experience as a senior government official, law partner, and business executive. He is senior counselor at Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer. He was deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs and deputy director of the National Economic Council, and he served as the ambassador to India from 2017 to 2021. Our moderator is Professor Raja Mohan. He is our new senior fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi, which is in partnership with our center in Mumbai, and that officially launches this week. He is a visiting research professor at ISIS, the Institute for South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He was the founding director of Carnegie India in Delhi. He's been involved in several think tanks in India, served on India's National Security Advisory Board, and he is a widely published journalist. Professor Mohan, I will hand this off to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Margaret. And let me begin by thanking the Asia Society Northern California for organizing this event. This is really a very, as they say in India, auspicious week for us. I mean, we're launching the Asia Society Policy Institute presence in Delhi in the next few days. We have Kevin Rudd, the president of Asia Society here in Delhi this next few days. So it's really a good moment as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of India's independence. We're also going to have widen the Asia Society's footprint in India. And it's also wonderful to be with Ambassador Ken Jester, who has been part of the growth of the relationship in the last couple of decades. So he knows perhaps the complexities and the progress and the problems in the relationship like very few other people in either country. So let me begin by giving you in a very, very brief, one of those American style brief histories of the relationship. You can think of the India-US relationship in 2 parts at least. You had the first part, the Cold War and the pre-independence period. In fact, in India, there was, though we had very little contact with the United States, the presidency of FDR, who began to talk about the importance of decolonization, generated extraordinary enthusiasm in India that FDR would be a champion of India's independence in the final phase of the independence struggle. But unfortunately, I mean, Roosevelt could not prevail over Winston Churchill. So that really, I mean, there was a disappointment in India, and that laid the basis for many of the later disappointments that, 81 years ago this month in the Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt did introduce the question of decolonization and freedom for the people who are in colonialism. But Churchill would not go with it, although it was written in there. He made it clear that that does not apply to India. And then we had the Cold War, in which 3 broad factors constrained the relationship. One was India's economic orientation that diverged from the American system, and it became increasingly difficult to build an economic partnership. The Cold War created conditions under which India and the US were really ranged on the opposite sides of the international situation. And within the region, the contradictions between U.S. policies towards Pakistan and China and India's relationship with the Soviet Union and created their own sets of problems. So we really couldn't, despite the best efforts or occasional serious moves by either side, we could not make much progress till the Cold War ended. And after the Cold War came to an end in 1991, we've seen extraordinary transformation of this relationship. The 1990s, there were a few problems. For example, the question of nuclear non-proliferation and other issues that constrained the relationship. But from President Clinton's visit to India in 2000, and especially under the George W. Bush administration, we saw a rapid, dramatic, and significant transformation of the relationship. In fact, I would dare say, at least for India, the changed relationship with the U.S. is probably the most significant one in the last 20 years. And perhaps for the United States as well, barring Central Europe, what Americans say New Europe, the growth in the relationship with India, too, has been one of the most important changes in the U.S. international relations. And to talk about the change and the current context and where we might go with it, we have Ambassador Ken Jester. Welcome, Ambassador. And you've been involved through multiple administrations in the last couple of decades in Commerce Department, later in the National Security Council, then as Ambassador to India. Are you surprised in reflection? I mean, that we've been able to construct this relationship, in the great changes that have taken place, starting from such a complex moments before. So how did we get to this bipartisan cooperation on both? There was bipartisan consensus on both sides. So what are the factors that led to the change in the relationship? Is it structural change in the international environment, in India's economic orientation? Is it because the leaderships in both countries were deeply committed? But we also had problems with the bureaucracies in both the countries, which are deeply suspicious of each other. So how would you characterize the factors that really transformed this bilateral relationship in the last 2 decades?
Well, thank you very much, Raja. It's a great pleasure to be here for the Asia Society program. I've been a long admirer of the Asia Society and also of you, Raja Mohan, and we've had a friendship for, I think, 20 years now on focusing on U.S. India relationship, but going beyond that as well. And you're regarded in my country as one of the great strategic thinkers in India and someone who has also been a player in the process here. And your question is a great one because people now may look at the U.S.-India relationship and think it was inevitable that it would be a close relationship, and yet it was anything but inevitable. And you've mentioned a variety of different factors that have contributed. But if you go back to, as you said, the visit of President Clinton and then later the real transformation that took place during the administration of George W. Bush, I think leadership, first and foremost, played a key factor in this. President Clinton was interested in India. He wanted to travel during his presidency. It got postponed for a variety of reasons, including the nuclear tests. But he ultimately did travel to India in 2000. But there were still obstacles, especially related to the nuclear issue, that were not able to be overcome. President Bush came into office with the simple idea that the world's oldest democracy, the United States, and the world's largest democracy, India, should have a better relationship. It seemed so self-evident. And he also felt that India is going to, by its sheer size and its economic growth, going to be a strategic player in Asia. And the United States should have a strong relationship with it. And a strong U.S.-India relationship and a strong India was ultimately in our interest. And so he really wanted to push forward the relationship. And I was fortunate to be among those involved in his administration. I think the big transformative idea was the civil nuclear deal, which was concluded during the second term of his administration. The discussions began with the Vajpayee administration in India and continued with Manmohan Singh. But to get there, we had to overcome a lot of hesitations, including bureaucracies that each doubted the reliability of the other. We began a high technology cooperation group that built up some confidence between the two sides as India wanted to gain further access to U.S. technology, and the United States wanted India to enhance its export controls and security around that technology. This led to the next steps in Strategic Partnership Initiative that laid out a progressive set of steps for cooperation in high technology, civil nuclear issues, civil defense issues, and other areas. And that gradually then led to the civil nuclear deal. But I think the key signal was from the leadership at the top, and it took President Bush and Prime Minister Singh to push through that nuclear deal. I think over time, the issue of China and the broader structural interest that each side has contributed. There were certainly, at the outset, some people who saw the U.S.-India relationship from the U.S. perspective as a way to hedge against what might happen with China. But at that time, the United States had a very strong relationship with China. We helped China get into the World Trade Organization. We were working closely with it on a range of initiatives. I can't speak for what may have been the motivations within India, but it was not driven in 2000, 2001 to 2008 by China as much, I think, as by leadership. But the China issue is certainly not absent. But over time, as China has risen further in the region and has become more aggressive and more expansionist, that has certainly galvanized the efforts to strengthen the strategic partnership and even expand to revitalizing the quadrilateral grouping with India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. And the pace of the strategic partnership and the Quad's efforts has certainly been accelerated due to Chinese activity in the region globally. I'd mention two other factors that I think have been important in the evolution of the relationship. One, below the leadership, there has been a cadre of officials in both governments that have been dedicated to pushing this effort forward. And when that cadre has not been active, sometimes the relationship has slid a little and not made progress because we had bureaucracies that were not oriented in a positive way toward each other by and large. And you needed people at the sub-cabinet level to really push to get things done. Ambassador Bob Blackfelt was a key player also in the strategic vision for the relationship. Minister Jay Shankar at one point was the Joint Secretary for the Americas and played a key role. Foreign Secretaries, Sham Saran, Conwell Sybil. So there are a variety of individuals who, along the way, helped push this relationship forward. The other factor I'd mention is the Indian diaspora. The number of Indian Americans has grown exponentially. We now have over 4 million, and that's provided a real glue to the relationship. And as that number of Indian Americans has grown, so has their political clout within the United States, and most importantly, with the U.S. Congress, which initially, I would say, was skeptical of the U.S.-India relationship, but now members of Congress are among the biggest cheerleaders of that relationship. There are other factors that have also contributed along the way, but I would say that those combinations and that evolution helps explain where we are today, but by no means was it a linear and direct path or an inevitable one. It took a variety of personalities and interests to make it happen.
Yes, Ken, you need both subjective and objective factors, subjective actual people who do things, and the objective, the structural factors that actually provide the conditions for. So I think we're really fortunate over the last 2 decades. We've had both these elements, which have really moved this relationship forward. The last 2 years, we've seen really the growth of the geopolitical convergence, the Quad, for the first time. I mean, India is sitting in a large number of institutions with the U.S. And the West. So we're now really seeing a new phase in the bilateral security and other cooperation. But to talk about a major problem that's emerging today, the crisis in Ukraine the war in Ukraine has shown some of the differences between India and the US of how to approach this question. Of course, India has had a historic relationship with Russia. So is the Russia problem going to be a deal breaker for India and the US? Can India and the United States navigate this crisis? Because the convergence in Asia is real and deep, but the differences over European security are also real. So how do we navigate this potential problem, a real problem today, and how do we transcend it in the coming days?
Well, it's a very important question. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown some of the complexities of the U.S. India relationship, and it is not. People sometimes think it's an alliance. It is not an alliance. It is a strategic partnership, and India has a different history and geographical position in the United States. And senior members of the U.S. government understand India's long relationship with first the Soviet Union and then Russia, which, as you alluded to in your introductory comments, as the United States during the Cold War leaned a bit toward Pakistan and opened up a relationship with China, India, while it had sought at one point weaponry from the United States, felt constrained to go to the Soviet Union, and in fact even signed a friendship treaty with Moscow in 1971, and has over the years gotten the vast majority of its military equipment from first the Soviet Union, now Russia, estimates of 60 to 70%. It certainly relies on Russia for spare parts for that equipment. And Russia's also been helpful to India at the United Nations. It's provided India with constructing nuclear power plants. It provides it with certain technology, nuclear submarines that other countries do not. And Russia often does this with less conditions than the United States or Western countries might do. So there's a long relationship, and also of significance, India does not want to push Russia closer to China. It wants to maintain its own relationship with Russia so that there can be hopefully some daylight between Russia and China. So that's the background. You now have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And while some people have said that's a European problem, I think that's not the correct lens to view it, because it really is, in my opinion, a problem relating to world order instability. The Russian invasion violated the basic principles of international relations for the past 70 plus years, in which they really unprovoked violated territorial integrity, borders, sovereignty. And this has implications not just for Europe, it has implications for the whole world, including Asia, where some of China's expansionist activity is also not fully respected territorial integrity and borders and at times sovereignty. And so this is something that the United States was hoping that India would be more vocal in speaking out against this, but understands, as I said, the complicated history that India has had with Russia. At this point, however, as a practical matter, I think Russia is going to find itself increasingly isolated politically and economically within the world, and it's going to be unable to, in my view, over time provide India with the advanced weaponry that it may seek, and it may even be unable to provide all of the spare parts. In fact, some of those spare parts, my understanding is, were made in Ukraine overall. And so this is going to put a strain on the relationship. In addition, if India wants to get the most advanced weaponry from the United States, the U.S. is going to have hesitations if that equipment is being mixed with equipment from an adversary, Russia. So there are limitations on the India-Russia relationship that I think will come into focus in the years ahead. And this is going to be an issue for India to navigate. I know that there's a desire in India that the world be multipolar and that Russia be one of those poles, and that India have the freedom to have strong relations with all of the major countries. But I think that as a practical matter, the Russian pole is going to not be to long. And India, if they're going to have to deal with the relationship or the challenge from China, and Russia may become increasingly dependent on China, inevitably, I think they're going to have to build up a stronger defense relationship with the United States and some of the other Western countries. That's going to be a choice for India, and how far they go, I don't think it will ever become an alliance, but I think managing that transition of moving away from Russia and perhaps further enhancing the relationship with the United States is going to be a possibility over the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm quite amazed the way in which the Biden administration, has been, careful to understand exactly the points that you made, and has, shall we say, navigated this issue of not letting the differences with India over Russia come in the way of building and expanding the Quad and the larger relationship. Those who are taking a longer view of India-US relationship and India's-Russia relationship. Russia, in some senses, is about India's past. In a sense, there was a context in the Cold War in which it came, and the question of China, balancing China, where Russia was an important factor. But today, Russia and China are close partners. And for India, the challenge of a unipolar Asia, where dominated by China, is really a big one. And that is not going to be addressed with Russia, but with the United States. So I think we are in a different context. Those who are trade, for example, India's trade with Russia, in spite of the recent oil purchases, etc., which is really a moment, an opportune moment there, but not really structural. If you see India-Russia trade is barely $10 billion, and it's less than Bangladesh trade, India's trade with Bangladesh. But the India-US trade has dramatically grown. You remember Bob Blackwell, who came to India as ambassador in 2001, talking about India-US trade. It was flat as a chapati. At that time, it was around $20 billion, if I recall right. But today we are at $160 billion. That's including services, where much of it goes to California, I presume. And the goods trade, the US is already the largest trading partner. So here is a paradox. The trade volumes have dramatically grown, but so have trade problems. And for you, trade has been a major focus. And I remember when Biden came to India many years ago, he talked about a $500 billion trade relationship between India and the US. So how is it that we made so much progress, but yet there's so much to be done in the bilateral trade relationship?
Well, you've really summarized it quite well. The trade relationship has continued to grow. I remember when I was ambassador, my commercial minister said, it's never been better. And I sort of said, but we have all these problems. But he said, but it's never been better. And so it has grown. When I was Undersecretary of Commerce, it was about 19 billion in goods and services. And when I left as ambassador, it was close to 150 billion. And now it's up to 160 billion. And yet for the world's largest and sixth largest economies, it doesn't fulfill its potential, in my view. And regrettably, right now, I worry that both countries are turning a bit inward with the notions of self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and barriers to trade are being increased in India. The United States has shown no appetite to negotiate bilateral trade agreements. India is negotiating agreements. It concluded one recently with the United Arab Emirates. It's concluded a framework agreement with Australia. It's negotiating with the UK, Canada, the European Union. And the United States has launched an initiative called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But both countries withdrew from regional trade agreements, which I think is going to create a challenge for them. India had been negotiating for 7 years in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. It withdrew at the last minute a couple of years ago. The United States had been a lead negotiator in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but it withdrew abruptly at the beginning of the Trump administration. And what's happened is we've ceded the ground to China. And China views the economic playing field as the one of sort of major competition, and it's been able to dominate. It has, I think, the leading bilateral trade partner with virtually every country in Asia. It is a leading member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and surprisingly, it's applied for the follow-on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the Comprehensive and the CPTPP agreement, and Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And they also have their Belt and Road Initiative to try to increase the dependence of other countries in the region on Chinese economic largesse to develop their infrastructure and connectivity. So the United States and India need to look at trade not just as an economic matter, but as a strategic matter, in my view. They need to have the political leadership to solve some of their small disputes, but then together try to have the leadership to help structure regionally what trade should look like, especially in emerging areas such as the digital economy, which are going to be critical for both countries. Otherwise, they'll find themselves on the outside looking in as China sets the standards and norms for international trade in the region and ultimately economic growth. So it is an area, as you said, where there's been great progress, but it's also one of unfulfilled potential. And I think it requires not just the trade ministers and the commerce ministers to get involved, but I think the political leadership, because it's as strategic as it is economic.
You mentioned digital trade. I mean, I'm sure there's of special interest to California. We've seen there has been an expansion of advanced technology cooperation on a range of issues, where the kind of link today that exists between Bangalore, Hyderabad on the Indian side, and Silicon Valley on the other, that you had a critical role, when you were dealing with the technology question. You remember we had the whole problem of export controls, technology controls from the U.S. side, and how did we overcome that? And where do you see beyond the trade question, given the dramatic technological revolution that's unfolding and India's own growing talent and capabilities and the Indians contributing to it in the United States, how do we leverage this, the emerging revolution? Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution or the technological revolution that covers artificial intelligence, semiconductors to space, to our range of areas. So how do you see this? How do we build on this possibility on the technological side, both the problems in the past as well as the potential for the future?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, technology has always been a key component of the relationship, and it's how I first got involved as a government official, because early on, India wanted increased access to U.S. technology, what's called dual-use technology. Technology that has both the civilian and military application, and because of the nuclear tests, a lot of Indian companies had been restricted from being able to gain such access. And so we worked out in the High Technology Cooperation Group and the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership roadmaps for how we could take Indian companies off the entities list and gradually increase India's access to U.S. technology as India built up its own capabilities through export controls and other safeguards to protect that technology and make sure it ended up being used for the purpose it was intended. There was initially resistance to that, but now India is very proud that it's a member of 3 of the 4 multilateral export control regimes, the Wassenaar Arrangement on dual-use items, the Australia Group on chemical and biological weapons, and the Missile Technology Control Regime. And it should be in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, but China has stood in the way of its membership. Today, it's much more of a partnership in terms of the potential on technology. As you mentioned, India has tremendous talent that goes along with technology. Sometimes the U.S. has a lead in some of the technology, for example, in artificial intelligence, but India has a lot of talent to contribute. And for something like artificial intelligence, data is a big element of that as well, because you need to have big data to analyze in order to build the models for artificial intelligence and the algorithms that you'll use. And so this is an area of tremendous potential. The 2 countries have set up cooperative work in this area. I think it's also something that the Quad countries want to do. But it goes back to making sure that there's a regime for the digital economy that makes sense. If India's been trying to look at how it's going to protect data, and there's been concerns that it will have restrictions on cross-border use of data, as well as perhaps extensive concerns about the privacy of data. And this, I think, could be a hamstring the operations of cooperation in this area. So this is something that the United States and India have to make sure that they can bring to bear the technology, the talent, and the data, that there are ways, because India feels the data is valuable, ways to monetize that data so that individuals get compensated for the use of their data, but that does not overly restrict or handicap technology companies in being able to get the benefits of the cross-border flow of data. But critical and emerging technologies is a huge challenge for the Quad countries in dealing with China's own effort to be strong in this area. And so it's going to take cooperation, not just with the United States and India, but with other countries such as Japan, Australia, and other partners to really work together on all of these technologies. And you mentioned other areas such as space, renewables, semiconductors, and these are ripe areas for cooperation in the years ahead.
One of the big changes in the relationship has been growing international cooperation. I mean, we used to remember there was a time when the U.S. counted how many times did India vote against the U.S. in the UN. I mean, probably Russia voted more with the U.S. than India did. From there, we've come to a point where actually there's a lot more engagement on multilateral global issues. And there, do we see this idea of like-minded coalitions, which the U.S. now talks about? Because the traditional multilateralism of the kind that expected from the United Nations, WTO, or the G20, that while those remain important, do we strengthen the like-minded coalitions? I mean, one Quad or G7 plus. So this is seemingly a major transition in the way the global governance is going to unfold. And a lot of it has to do with what you said about technology standards. So in a way, China's weaponization of multilateral institutions and Russia's full support for China is opened up a new space. So where do you see this range of international cooperation?
Yeah, well, what's happened over time is that some of the multilateral institutions have simply become less effective. They have broad membership. They often require consensus, and they get into a stalemate. And especially now after COVID, there's concern of some countries in terms of who they can rely on, who they cannot rely on for supply chains and issues of that like. And so the notion of trusted partners or like-minded coalitions has gained acceleration in the last few years. And I think that is a way of dealing with some of the particular challenges we face, whether it be in pandemics or in climate issues or infrastructure and the like. I do think there's a foundational set of issues relating to defense and security where it can't just be a loose, like-minded coalition or just, on this issue, we'll get this group of people, on that issue, we'll get that group of people. If, for example, India has to worry about Chinese behavior on its northern border and whether if the Chinese took an aggressive action, India would be prepared, it's ultimately going to need, in my opinion, assistance from the United States. And that will only happen if there's a greater degree of really coordination of planning, of coordination, of integration. You can't just one day say, hey, send over airplanes and other items if fighting begins. And so I think for the foundational or basic issues of defense and security, you really need to have very close and integrated relationships with some key partners. Whether you call it an alliance or something short of that, you have to have that type of relationship. I think for other types of regional or global issues, you can form these coalitions of the willing, of trusted partners. I think it would be a mistake if countries think that they can all handle everything on their own. I mean, there is this notion today that everyone wants to be the exporter, but not the importer. Everyone wants to benefit from a trade agreement or globalization, but not make any compromises. And we're going to have to work these things out and realize that together, trusted partners can achieve more than we can alone and try to be self-reliant or self-sufficient on everything.
So we will soon go to the audience for questions. So please send in your questions. And before that, I had one last question in our general discussion. It is about the both Americans and Indians. You want to put a label on the relationship. I mean, say allied or non-allied or allied. So this problem of definition. Sometimes, as you know, you served in the government, sometimes the labels actually complicate things. So you said, look, India and U.S. are not going to be allies, or not allies now, allies in a very technical definition, but they're doing a lot more things together. So how do you see this, the question of can we be stronger partners as two large countries, and India eventually will become the third largest economy? That can we find a framework that is different from the kind of historic framework the U.S. had with the Europeans and the Northeast Asians on classical alliances? So is there a middle path somewhere there for us to work out a relationship that kind of is different in its terms of engagement, yet does a lot of things together?
That's an excellent question. And I think some of this is going to be up to India, because I think the United States, as you've mentioned, there is bipartisan consensus on the benefits of a strong U.S. India relationship and of a strong India in the Indo-Pacific region. I think there is historically been a reluctance of India coming out of its colonial past to be in a alliance where it feels it is subservient to another country's wishes. And India was, as you know, a leader of the non-aligned movement and speaks more recently of strategic autonomy. But I think that, as I was indicating in my last answer, India has to decide, and the Russian issue is one area where this comes up, do they want to have strong, equidistant relationships with all key countries and be able to have issue-oriented coalitions, or do they need at some fundamental level, whether you call it an alliance or a strategic partnership, but some greater integration with a few key players that will make sure that its defense and security are adequate, at least until India is able to develop the indigenous capabilities in the military area to do this on its own. And countries may never be able to do it all on their own. You have strength in partners. So we ought not get hung up on the labels. We ought to understand the complexities of the relationship. But I do think it's sort of more going to be India than the United States that determines the speed and depth of what occurs. In some respects, you're pushing on an open door. And I do think that it will take time. None of these things happen quickly. But I hope that we can have a tighter defense planning and relationship as exigencies arise in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. But this is really what's going to be critical of the next 5 to 10 years, is how is this going to be navigated? And as you say, how do you handle the public relations of it, as well as the internal governmental interactions about these issues?
So we have a number of questions coming in. So I'll begin with some which we didn't address in our conversation. One is about the question of environmental change. How do we work together? We've seen, certainly under the Modi government, from saying this is not our problem, we didn't create it, you guys did it, the developed countries, you do the solution as well, to one where actually there's been a conscious effort under PM Modi to say, look, India will be part of the answer and that India will work together with the... So where do you see that going? I mean, in terms of both the US debate as well as the potential for cooperation between India and the US on working out new rules, developing new technologies, because it can't simply be done by negotiations in a grand setting, but you need new technologies, you need new ways of rearranging the relationship between economy and energy. So where do you see that potential for cooperation between India and the US?
The energy partnership between our two countries has grown enormously over the last 4 or 5 years. That's one of the things I look back on during my tenure as ambassador with great pride, that we really became a leading energy provider for India and enhanced India's energy security. Everyone recognizes that the transition to renewables is important and would happen sooner than later. But we also have to be realistic and acknowledge that it's not going to occur overnight, and it's a transition process. One of the things that India can do is increase its imports of natural gas. And we've had a natural gas task force that we worked on. We're working on looking at hydrogen as an energy source. But recognizing the enormous economic growth challenges that India and China face, we have to accept that there will still be the use of fossil fuels for several years to come. So we have to look not just at renewables, but how do we increase the ability to have clean carbon, carbon capture, and other ways to make the fossil fuel use more efficient. As I said, a transition more to natural gas. These are all areas that we can and should cooperate on. We have to do it realistically. We also have to work on adaptation and recognizing that some of climate change may occur regardless of efforts that are made, and that may have consequences for coastal areas, and how do you adapt and work on that. But this is an area of great discussion between our two countries. One of the issues that India and some of the developing countries do request is funding for their commitments, and this has been a difficult area for all the Western countries to come up with the resources to support that. So that will be another issue and challenge for both countries. But as you've said, the discussion, like most issues in U.S.-India relations, day to day, the discussions can sometimes be challenging. But when you step back and look at where they were 5 years ago and where they are today, a tremendous amount is accomplished. And I would say that is the case in terms of energy and environmental cooperation.
One of the issues which has been raised in the question box was the seeming hypocrisy, in a sense. The Europe continues to import Russian oil. In fact, in a way, Europe's dependence on Russian oil and natural gas is huge, while there's a lot of criticism of India. But I thought the Biden administration was far more careful in how it frames the issue. And in fact, it is today talking about working together to deal with the problem, because it's the energy crisis has hit not just India, but a whole lot of countries, developing countries. So that's one part. I mean, that we need to address that problem. How do you cut revenues to Russia without choking off oil supplies because to the rest of the developing world, including India? So that's one part of it. The second part was U.S. India doing more on the energy front. I mean, recently, ExxonMobil has signed an agreement with the ONGC, the Oil and Natural Gas Corporation of India, which does the exploration, a cooperation on exploration, because India's internal exploration of its maritime and land territories, we need to do more finding oil on our own territory. And I think this partnership between ExxonMobil and India, that's the kind of thing we need to do, find actual practical solutions rather than simply argue about the conditions under which we deal with the problem.
You got a lot of different points in that question. First on dealing with Russia and oil imports, the argument in the West is that Europe, while they're importing a substantial amount of energy from Russia, is gradually seeking to lower that. And the concern is that India is increasing its volume of imports. But at the same time, the total amount of Indian imports is infinitesimal relative to that in Europe. And it's very tough, in my opinion, for other countries to complain about India when they're still importing a substantial amount from Russia. Over time, we're going to have to all, if the war keeps up and Russia's committing atrocities, work our way to lowering imports from them. And as you said, we're now discussing different ways of managing that situation. I was involved when I was in the State Department during the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and putting together the Gulf War coalition. And we recognized that the sanctions on Iraq were going to have a detrimental impact on a variety of countries. And we sought to offset the sanction impact with other measures. And that's what we've got to do here as well. As sanctions are being imposed, it's had collateral damage, and the countries imposing the sanctions have to work with those countries experiencing the collateral damage to figure out ways to lessen that if you want to make the sanctions effective over time. So these are all areas that are ripe for discussion. They may become more acute if the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues for a long time, as it may well. And there may be, as you said, issues of food shortages, fertilizer shortages, other commodity issues, as well as energy. But this is one of the collective problems that we have to address.
We didn't discuss too much on the latest developments occurring in Asia, especially in relation to Taiwan. So I have a question on that. I mean, what are the kind of, the crisis is building up, India generally had tried to stay away from one China policy, given its commitment to one China policy. What we've seen some interesting developments in the last few days. India is no longer reaffirming its one China policy. Certainly since its own problems with China on the border have increased. And at the same time, India can't join the U.S. and Japan and the other Quad partners in denouncing China when itself is fighting, has almost 60,000 soldiers standing for a second winter at the 14,000 feet in the high Himalayas. So on the Taiwan question, which has potential to hugely destabilize the region, how do we expand the engagement between India and the U.S. and what are the expectations in Washington of India?
Well, again, this is a very complicated issue. The premise behind the one China policy is that any changes in China's relationship, mainland China's relationship with Taiwan, will occur peacefully. And some of that now has been undercut by China's own actions in Hong Kong, where it violated its commitments in terms of, one country, two systems in Hong Kong. No one is looking for Taiwan to declare independence and create a clash with China, but also no one wants to see China try to incorporate Taiwan by force. And therefore, people recognize, especially in terms of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, what are the lessons that we need to take, and how do we try to make clear to the Chinese that they need to negotiate a solution with Taiwan and work on trying to peacefully resolve that issue over time and not consider the use of force. At the same time, the Chinese seem to have made clear by President Xi that he's not going to leave incorporation of Taiwan into the mainland China for the next generation. It's an issue that he wants to solve during his tenure. And so, again, the next 5 to 10 years are going to be very critical. My assumption is that China doesn't seek a conflict at this time, but it's certainly trying to build up its military capabilities if it chooses to have a conflict in 5 or 10 years from now. And other countries have to figure out what they need to do relative to Taiwan and their own commitments and capabilities to try to indicate to the Chinese that any military action would be a mistake. And this is something that we should be discussing with our partners. And it has been noted that India has taken a slightly more nuanced position recently. There is an opportunity for increased India-Taiwan trade, as there is in the United States. And we'll have to see how that plays out, but it's part of the dynamic elements of this region. And it's why, as I said earlier, you can't look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an isolated activity. It sort of has broader ramifications for some of the changes going on in the world more broadly. And it should not give China license to feel that it can now take military action against Taiwan in the same way that Russia is doing against Ukraine.
Talking about one China policy and the recent visit of Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, there's a lot of focus in the U.S. on the complex U.S. position in relation to Taiwan. But there is also Tibet, which is equally problematic. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi has also been a great champion of Tibet and Tibet's rights within China. So here, and then if you look at the Tibet as an issue, we see gathering storm clouds. We have, as I said, 60,000 troops. They're locked in a fight in the high Himalayas, in the Ladakh sector. We have recently, His Holiness Dalai Lama went to Ladakh, which is again, the dispute between India and China over Ladakh is also sharpened politically and diplomatically. And then India and the U.S. are doing exercises close to the China border. So is this issue, there was a time when Tibet issue seemed to dominate Washington's thinking. Is it still a live issue in the U.S. Or is it something really that pales into, relative obscurity given what else is happening in the world?
No, I think it's still a live issue. I mean, a lot of people don't understand the U.S. system, and when they think when the Speaker of the House travels to a foreign country, it's done necessarily in coordination with the administration. It's not the case, and I think ideally the Biden administration probably would not have wanted Speaker Pelosi to go to Taiwan or to be provocative on Tibet, because they realize this is a sensitive time with China, with the Party Congress going to convene later this year to potentially give President Xi an unprecedented third term. And yet the speaker did that because these are live issues, and there is a strong American commitment to the Tibetans, to preserving Tibetan culture. There's a significant appropriation that occurs every year to provide assistance to the Tibetans. This is also, as you know, has a long history with India and really is perhaps the source of some of the India-China problems. But I think there is great sensitivity to Tibet, to what's going on with the Uyghurs in the northwest of China, and to Taiwan. And so all of these issues are coming together, and it's why there is accelerated activity among the Quad countries and continued strengthening of the U.S. India partnership. This is the most dynamic region of the world, and yet it's one that's undergoing a tremendous amount of change. The tectonic plates of stability are shifting around, and we'll have to see, again, hopefully there'll be leaders, going back to your initial question, in all of these countries that will rise to the occasion and address these issues in a collective and thoughtful way.
There's one question on Japan that, the sense that, look, Japan is passive. I mean, that's a general perception of Japan as a passive player. Can we get Japan to do more? But actually, if you look at the last 15 years, especially on the Indo-Pacific construct, it was really Japan that developed the idea. Initially, both Delhi and Washington had cold feet. It's really Japan has already taken the intellectually, surprisingly, I would say, in the last decade to really build the Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical construct. And since Ukraine, it's quite staggering to see the kind of changes Japan wants to do, strengthen its own military capability, strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis China, to do more with India and other Asian countries, to build regional partnerships. We're already members of the Quad. India has a special relationship with Japan. How do you see the Japanese role in shaping India-US partnership in the next few years?
Well, it goes back to your initial question on leadership and on structural interests. And again, Japan's had a bit of both. Prime Minister Abe was critical in the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific in a speech he made in 2007 to the Indian Parliament. And he has really tried to reorient Japan a bit to being more concerned about its security and being a little more forward-leaning, despite its constitutional limitations on what it can do. And you also see now the interest of Japan. China has given its difficulty in the East China Seas, and they're concerned about what China is doing in its exercises relative to Taiwan and its activity. And so Japan has been very important in energizing the Quad, in developing a much stronger relationship with India. I think that's been critical in the last several years. You see Japan providing a lot of assistance in the northeastern states in India. And we now see military exercises. The Malabar exercise is, often was a three-country exercise with Japan, United States, and India. It's expanded to Australia. So Japan has become a very dynamic and important player. And Australia, by the way, you didn't ask about this, but has become much more active in the last several years, in part because of what China has done in Australia, sought to question what the origins were of COVID-19. The Chinese hit them with all sorts of sanctions, and the Australians have said, we don't like that, and have stood up. And so Chinese activity, along with leadership in these countries, has accelerated the degree of cooperation among Quad members. And I think you'll see Quad plus groupings as well in dealing with the range of challenges that are going to be on the radar over the next few years.
No, thanks. Thanks for that question. I think my time is running out, and I'll go back to Margaret. But before that, I just wanted to say to thank you again for the stimulating conversation. We've not been able to touch on all the issues. There are questions about the domestic politics in both the countries. But what is significant, I thought, looking at the last 20 years, there's no shortage of people who are pessimistic about the relationship at any given time. What stands out is how India-US relationship has defied gravity. The pessimism at every time would say, look, this can't go further. But yet we kept moving forward. And we have a relationship, which I think the cup is more than half full. And the question is, in the next few years, how do we make it more fuller and do the progress towards the fuller realization of the partnership?
I agree with you completely.
India and the United States.
Yeah, no,
so
I fully agree with you. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you about these issues, Raja.